Hi, I'm Bob Kolb, Professor of Finance at Loyola University, where I also hold the Frank W. Considine Chair of Applied Ethics. And joining me today is Tom Bugnitz. Tom Bugnitz is not only a great business person, but he's also a friend of mine. He's a principal in the Beta Group, which consults in technology strategy. And Tom's joining us today to talk about IT risk as a threat to business strategy. Tom has a very distinguished background. He's been on the faculty at Washington University in St. Louis. He's a co-author of the book From Business Strategy to IT Action, which is published by John Wiley and Sons. Through his work with the Beta Group, Tom has consulted with a whole myriad of companies, some of which have a certain amusing element at this date. But at a happier time, he and his firm worked quite extensively with AIG. But he's also worked with the FBI, General Motors, and Valero Energy. So Tom, thank you very much for joining us to talk about IT strategy and especially how it interacts with business risk. So we've had a lot of conversations about your work over the years, and I think you have a very interesting and perhaps unique approach in terms of integrating your work with IT into business strategy and looking at that as an element of risk. So maybe you could sort of just start by giving a brief view of how you and your firm approach this.
Thanks, Bob. The approach we generally take is that we shouldn't be spending any money on technology that isn't directly connected to the business strategies of a company. It seems obvious, but in most companies is a relatively new approach because they tend to focus on operational decisions with IT. So our approach is to get to a company, define as crisply as possible what their strategic intentions are. What do we intend to do with this business over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? Take those definitions, look at all of the money they're spending on technology, every single dollar, and try to match the impact of those dollars against those strategies. So we evaluate every dollar that's being spent with every business strategy of the company and try to decide what are the dollars that are affecting the business in the most positive way, what are the dollars that are not having impact. And then create a plan for a business that says, given that baseline, how do we spend our dollars going forward in the most effective way possible to support the business strategy? We always start with the business strategy and fill in with technology later.
Okay, so perhaps this is a little simple-minded, but I think what you're basically saying is that technology spending should contribute to profitability if it's to have value.
What a concept.
But of course, you could say that's true of any spending in any company for anything, but I think it has a special salience in terms of technology.
Actually, the techniques we use, many of the companies we worked with have ended up using it for every type of spend they have, particularly capital spending. We believe it's most effective for technology because business leaders typically aren't paying as close attention as they really think they are to the technology spending. It seems to have still, in this day and age, some mystique to it. And so it has a lot of traction in the technology area because it gives the business people a way to look at their technology that isn't based on the technology. It's based strictly on business impact of what those dollars are doing.
You mentioned that technology has a certain mystique, but maybe it also has a certain cachet in the sense that maybe people like to spend on technology in a way they don't perhaps like to spend on logistics?
Well, we've seen two different flavors in companies. It's very interesting, and there's no way to tell based on industry, based on maturity, how a company views that. There's some companies who say technology is a problem for us, actually. It's money we got to spend. We know we have to spend it to be competitive. If we didn't have to, we'd rather put that money on marketing or manufacturing. Then there's other companies who are just like you said, hey, this is cool. We should do this because in our business, we're just going to be that way. We're going to be the technological leaders with not any clear sense of why that's important in their business. So we see that in both directions. It's very interesting, and it doesn't break down particularly by industry, type of company, size of company. It really depends on the people there.
Well, as a somewhat geeky guy, maybe I'd be permitted to ask this. Is it to some extent a case of boys with toys?
Well, there's an enormous number of female CIOs these days. So I think it is in some ways. Many CIOs who in the years from 95 to 2005 were trying to become part of the business culture are now, the CIO position is becoming more of the technology culture again. You're the chief technology officer, even though they don't want to say that. So many CIOs are now becoming the technologist, and it is toys at that point. It's how do I get the technology for the company, not how do I support the business of the company.
I see here. So yes, you're really trying to bring IT into the overall strategy, strategic focus of a company.
Except in very specific cases, IT is only an enabler of the strategy of the company. And that's what we're trying to focus on, and that's what we're trying to make the connection. I spend money on IT, I improve the results of the company.
Right. So part of the things I want to focus on today are IT and risk management in IT. But given your interest, we could focus that a little more particularly on IT's risk to the strategy.
Right.
For instance, do problems in IT threaten the business's ability to implement its core strategy
right.
and thus to achieve profitability?
Right.
And I think you have some really interesting work that you've done. I sort of selected from presentations I've heard you give before a couple of cases. And I mean, I only mentioned 4 clients, but you really have a myriad of clients, and a lot of them have been in financial services. So the first one maybe we could discuss is this Japanese financial services firm that you've done some work with. And the slide shows, I guess, heat map or risk map. So maybe you could start out just by describing the information that's shown on the map.
One of the things we would do is we would take and look at all of the applications, the computer systems and the individual applications that a company is running. And sometimes that's even a challenge to get that list. Companies, in many cases, really don't know everything they got and everything they're doing in technology. This was particularly true in this company in Japan, which was about a 60-year-old company who had built up a lot of systems over the years and didn't really know everything they had. First thing we did is we took and we made that list. What are you doing? Then we'd help their management define their business strategies. And the first step was, for each of those applications, what impact is it having on those business strategies? So the data you see on the left-hand side of that chart is really the business impact of those applications. The second thing we look at then, in terms of the risk profile, is how robust are those systems? How well can we take care of those systems? How adaptable are they to changing business conditions? In general, as a system or an application, if something changes in the business, is that application going to be able to come along with us, or is it going to hurt us? Is it going to keep us from making changes we want? And that's what the risk portion of that data looks like.
Right. So in terms of understanding the heat map, out in the main body of the chart, you have squares or blocks with colors, and each has a number in it. So the colors, I suppose like standard heat maps, represent intensity or threat in some way, with the red obviously being more threatening than green. And then the numbers also show in a way the same information, right? And range from 1 and 2s to red on down to 4 and 5 for green.
Right.
So in a way, the numbers are a little bit redundant, but they're not quite the same.
Well, it's interesting. It's back to the boys with toys. People like to see visually the big blocks of stuff come out. And so what we try to do with this data is not show them individual applications. We try to show them big areas of problem. And so when they look at the colors, that seems to be more important to people than the numbers themselves. They see, this area is bad. We got a bunch of bad stuff there. They don't care about the individual numbers.
Right. But the numbers are actually, they do have information that they're a little more fine-grained. And so explain, if you would, how you generated these numbers.
It's very interesting. The thing we've discovered over the 20 years of the business is that for the most part, business management doesn't understand what's going on with technology. They have an idea of what's going on maybe in their small area, and the applications and systems are supporting them, but in general they don't understand much outside their area, and they don't understand how any of that relates to their business. So all of those numbers were generated by getting all the business senior managers of that company in a room for 8 hours basically, and looking at every single application and every single system, and developing in a consensus way what that assessment is for each of those boxes on that chart.
Right, so basically an interview technique, and this is the numbers and the colors represent the considered judgment of management about the risk that they face. So you've got all these systems. You go through, you identify all the systems, you figure out with the help of management what they regard as the risk. And so in this particular company, that led you to focus on something that was really kind of special as a particular issue.
Yeah, it was very interesting. They had wanted to redo all of their core systems, the systems that really ran the business. They wanted somewhere in the order of $50 million to rewrite everything that was there. The president of that company had chosen not to spend that money for a very logical and basic reason. They work. Why would I spend $50 million on something that works well? And they did. If you look at the assessment of the functionality of those systems, it's pretty good. The systems work very well. And so for a number of years, the CIO had been trying to make the case, I need money to redo those systems on a functional aspect. And that didn't cut anything because they functioned very well. Well, we did this risk analysis, and the red in that is based on one very fundamental fact. All of those systems were written in something called assembly language, which, being a geek enough, you know what that is. You may have even programmed in it.
I tried one time.
Yeah, one time.
But yes, but so let's explain to the audience, for historical purposes, if nothing else, what assembler is.
If we look at the guts of any computer, from the big mainframes that I used to work on to the PCs we work on today, there's a number of layers of how we instruct the computer what to do. The most basic is a machine language. It's actually the zeros and ones, and there are instructions in that machine language. Well, the next layer up, in an attempt to make it easier to program computers, we invented something called assemblers, which are very arcane commands that look nothing like anything you would know about as a normal human being, that people were taught to write programs in because it's very efficient to write at that because you're so close to the computer. So it's a very old language. Very few people know how to use it, if anybody anymore, except in the bowels of companies like Intel or Microsoft that need to get that close to the hardware. And in fact, if you went to hire an assembly language programmer anywhere in this country today, it would be almost impossible. It would be almost impossible for the kind of language that was written in.
Right. So yeah, and above the assembler, then you have regular programming languages like C, Fortran, Pascal, COBOL, blah blah blah. So okay, so it's programming down close to the metal.
It's very close to the silicon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they were actually writing their programs for this financial services company,
right,
using assembler.
Well, and the programs had been written in the early 70s, and at that point, there were a lot of people that had those skills, and it was actually a pretty effective way to write programs for certain applications and for certain machines. So that's what they were basing their whole business on. Essentially a 30 to 35-year-old piece of technology that worked great.
Well, it sounds good. I drove a car. It's 100 years old technology. So what's the problem?
Yeah, and in a small context of today, there's no problem at all. And the reason that worked was because the people who wrote those systems were actually still on the job, and they were taking care of those systems. So they had 30 years of institutional memory about how all that worked. At the time we did this assessment, most of those guys were between 51 and 53 years old. And mandatory retirement for that company was 55. So the reason we have a lot of red on those applications is that it is definite that the people taking care of those programs will be gone in 2 years, and nobody else will be able to do that. And in a very short period of time, those systems will stop functioning.
Is that somehow related to the title of this, The Risk of Early Retirement?
That's exactly why we call it The Risk of Early Retirement.
I thought it was a pretty good hunch, I thought.
Yeah, yeah.
So another way of looking at this is it makes their whole system so fragile in that it all depends on the slender thread of these handful or couple of guys who've been around for 30 years who know this arcane language.
That's right.
And can maintain that. So what did the part written in assembler that these guys were maintaining, what did it do? Why? Who cares? Why was it important?
It was the basic core systems of this financial services company. It ran everything that the financial services company needed to do. It was getting new customers in, it was keeping track of those customers and their accounts, it was handling all the transactions. It was the guts of that company. Operationally, it was the company.
Right, so if these assembler programmers went out to lunch and got in a car accident, or in 2 years they're going to retire, what would the firm do the next day? They wouldn't be able to do anything with their systems if they ever needed maintenance.
They'd be fine the next day.
Right.
And they'd probably be fine the day after that. And a week later, they'd start thinking about things that might they need to do, but they can't do because those guys are here. And we figured within 6 months, those systems would grind to a halt. So the company was essentially looking at a situation where in 6 months after they retired, it wouldn't be able to operate.
So what was senior management's reaction when you brought this perspective to them?
Well, in a very, if I translate it from the Japanese, it was basically nobody ever explained it to us this way before. Okay, it was we have been being told we need to replace these systems because they're old, and that didn't make any sense to us because they work, and old things work, as we both know. And so the real issue to the CEO was nobody had told him about the risk, and he didn't understand how dependent he was, not only on the systems, but on those 2 or 3 guys that he walked past every day at their desk. Didn't realize they were actually keeping his company afloat in a very interesting way.
Did you get a raise for these guys?
No, they still retired at 55.
Oh, that might have been another avenue of consulting income, but we won't go there. So, to me, I mean, this is just shouts fragility.
It's a classic case of 2 parts of the fragility. One is very complex systems dependent on very, as you say, very fragile components underneath to keep running. And the second is a business management, senior management of a fairly large company not understanding that fragility and the risk that it brought to their business. They thought of it only as all those people are risks to the technology. They never made the link between the risk those people brought to their business functioning and even being able to continue.
All right. I think another interesting part of this case is that it shows the linkage between IT risk and technology management on the one hand and people risk on the other.
Exactly. Exactly. We do think of technology as being faceless and nameless, but in fact, in most companies, there is an enormous amount of institutional memory about how things work, how the business works, how the technology works. And companies actually, and this is a fairly serious problem in federal and state governments. We do a lot of work for state governments over the last number of years. The average age we see when we're in there is in the 50s of all the people running the technology, from the management to the people actually doing the work. We go back 2 years later, and interestingly, the average age has increased 2 years. There's nobody coming in underneath, and all of the knowledge is getting older, and it's leaving. And there's a serious risk to the way our government systems work, which may be good or bad, that in a number of years, those people are going to be gone, and we don't know how to take care of, very similar to this situation.
Right. So, in this case, I mean, obvious risk is being able to continue to do just what you're doing, right? If the guys are gone, you can't maintain the system just to have the functionality. But also, given higher level programming languages in which it's possible to program much more quickly, much more efficiently, not from a machine perspective, but from a human perspective, having systems that rely on assembler also, I think, limit the way in which they can use technology to respond to strategic advantage opportunities.
Exactly. One of the issues we do look at in terms of risk for companies that are interested in this area is the competitive risk of our technology. How important is technology in our industry, but how important is it for our technology to support the decisions management makes in a timely way? And we've seen just instances in every single client where management wanted to make a competitive move and was held up by the technology. And it's not only something like written in assembler, it's systems that are written in very, very current languages, very current tools, but have been connected in such a way that you can't change one system without affecting everything else in the business. And we see that particularly in financial services company. All of the systems are so intertwined that it's not the tool itself, it's the way the systems have been constructed prevent us from making changes as quickly as we need.
Right. So summing up the case of the Japanese company, they had risk in the sense of something bad could happen, so they couldn't keep doing what they were already doing.
Right.
But they also had risk in a threat to their strategy and their ability to implement responses to competition, or not just responses, but to initiate their own actions to overcome competition.
Exactly.
So I think that's really very interesting about the everything hinging on these just couple of people.
Couple of guys down there, yeah.
Right. So let's turn to another example, and You've done some work with a lot of financial institutions, as you've mentioned. I think I know you've worked for USAA Bank pretty recently. But the next case is really a banking network with, I think you said it had about 50 branches and with multi-state locations.
Right.
So perhaps you could describe the kind of work that you did for them generally, and then we'll look more specifically at some of the systems.
Yeah, this was a very fun project, both because the people who ran the bank are very good people, and because it was a falling off a log kind of engagement where it was fairly obvious what the issues were. They called us in to look at the core software and to decide if that core software would support their business going forward. All the things we just talked about in Japan, you know, competitive reaction, innovations in the banking industry. What we discovered very quickly was that the issue wasn't that core software. It worked fine, and it was going to continue to work fine for foreseeable future. The problem they had was they had made over the years individual incremental decisions to add new functions by adding new programs from other vendors, writing some of their own, for each of the things they had to do in the bank, whether it was wealth management, credit card processing, mortgages, some of their commercial things. They started an ATM network that they supported. So they added technology around that core software. When you add technology in any business, typically it's not isolated. It needs to share data with other systems. So as soon as you add that technology, you create links to other systems. So you end up with a fairly large network of applications, data exchange.
Well, so you said core systems. I'm thinking, okay, core systems, if it's at the core, it's got to be one or two, okay, maybe 3 or 4, but maybe that's not quite right as the next slide indicates.
Yeah. Well, particularly in a bank, the core system of the bank is typically the transactions, deposits, withdrawals, checking, savings, keeping track of CDs. That's what's considered in banking the core system. But as soon as we start doing other things in banks, like wealth management, brokerage services, processing credit cards, processing mortgages, they actually have, they wouldn't call it a core system in the bank, but those functions have their own core system to operate that function. And it's tying all of those things together, because a customer for a bank interacts with each of those systems. Ideally, he interacts with all of them because we've sold him all of our services.
Right, so in this chart, well, first let me ask a very straightforward question. How many core systems are there on this chart?
Oh, God, Bob, I haven't even counted, but I'm guessing there's at least 10 at the big level, and then the rest of them, 40, 50, 60?
Yeah, I was guessing 50 circles.
Yeah, at least.
We don't need to count.
Yeah.
But so you went into this bank, which, you know, it's a pretty big bank, across several states, had 50 locations, right? And these are all the different kinds of functionalities represented by the circles. Okay, so I mean, you know, a big institution, they have to do a lot of things. And maybe there's not a problem with that, or maybe there is in terms of those connections.
It's the connections that became the problem, absolutely.
Well, let's turn then to the next slide, which shows information flows among these different functionalities. Right. I call this your spaghetti slide.
Yeah, we call it the spider web up there. They seem to like the spider too. So yes, it's the spaghetti slide.
So, okay, you know, for people who don't know much about programming, so what? I mean, isn't that what programs are supposed to do? Pass data?
They are supposed to pass the data. The problem we had at the bank was that the systems weren't sharing the data, first of all, in a timely way, and second, some of the data wasn't being shared at all. The particular example that got everybody's attention was a depositor at a particular branch who had somewhere in the order of $2 million in his checking account, and that didn't include wealth management and everything else, who went to another branch in the same state, and they wouldn't cash his check because he didn't have an account with them, even though it was the same bank. And that was on a Saturday. He was at a football game in this particular area. And on Monday, he moved all of his accounts to another bank.
Let's see, $2 million in a checking account. Is that profitable for the bank to have that?
We thought it was.
Right, and certainly they got their attention, never mind his other funds and his network of acquaintances and so on.
And so the way the bank responded was they thought it had to do with how the branches worked together. Why weren't they able to know who their big customers were? That's a very legitimate question. The real answer was that the branch that he was in didn't have any access to information anywhere else because of the complexity of those systems.
Right, so obviously it wouldn't be a fix to give information about your big depositors, because then your medium-sized depositors might want to cash a check somewhere too.
Exactly.
So obviously to solve that basic problem, they're going to have to completely revamp their information system.
Exactly. And the issue, and the way we got to the spaghetti chart, was that each of those circles on that chart were incremental individual decisions that were made specifically to solve a very certain problem. And they were all very intelligent decisions, but they were made independently and in the vacuum of what's my problem right here. They didn't have an overall view of what the architecture of their business, of their strategy, technology would look like.
Right, what the problem of incrementalism.
Exactly.
Oh, I know how to fix this problem for right now.
That's right.
I mean, you run into that in many, many different contexts.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So anyway, they wound up with a system where they're passing in a very complex way data among all these different functionalities.
Exactly.
And so when you showed this chart to management, how did they respond to that?
Well, it was the first time they had understood the complexity of what they were dealing with, and how that complexity really hurt their ability to make decisions. They had been told about the spider web, and they didn't quite understand what that meant. Mm-hmm. And that chart was what got their attention, again, back to your words before, the fragile nature of what they're doing. They would want to do new things in their bank that were really just tracking the competition. It would take maybe a year. They need to get it done in months. The follow-on to that chart was a chart of all the things that companies like Charles Schwab and Ditech were doing to provide financial services. They want to know how we could do it. We said, you've got all the systems in place to do that. You can't because of the way these are all connected. That's what's getting in the way of responding to new functions. And they understood that. They didn't understand why the technology was so complicated. They understood it was holding their business up.
And so, well, it looks like they need to clean this up. Must take a couple weeks to do
Absolutely.
that, right?
If you had the right guys, yeah. And so we figure that's about a 4-year project to get that cleaned up, partly because the functions of the bank are so intertwined with the technology of the bank. So you can't make changes easily. But the real fundamental thing was nobody understood what all the pieces were yet. That was the high-level description of what's going on there. There's probably, for each of those circles, another 5 to 10 circles of their own connected to each of them, sharing data with the other 5 to 10 on every other box.
Right, and so to create this chart, you actually went in and looked at all these systems,
Absolutely.
Your firm, and traced those connections to start to understand that.
Right.
So, well, we don't have the finished product yet. I mean, this is a fairly recent engagement, I know, and they're in the midst of this 4-year project to fix things up. It'd be very interesting to see the new cleaned up chart that shows the same information once they do that and complete that.
Absolutely.
Well, I think this too shows, again, 2 points. One, with your example about the big depositor who couldn't cash a check, they couldn't perform the normal functions of their business as it already existed. But also, then they couldn't innovate because they'd keep adding more and more complexity into this system in a way that couldn't share that new information either.
Right. What we've learned about complexity, particularly in IT systems, is that the more complex they are, the less adaptable they are to anything new that comes along. And that's true in biology, and it's true in these systems. And so that they were very well adapted to the business that they were running, let's say 5 years ago, before a lot of the technology innovations came along that would allow people to do other things. Very well adapted. Those systems work great. It looks complicated, but the bank works very well, and it makes a lot of money. The problem they're having is they can't change and they can't adapt because what they built was very specific to the way they did business 5 years ago. Now, how do I go forward into the future? They're hamstrung by that complexity.
All right, so just summing up, we could say that what we really had today is a story of 2 things, fragility and complexity in IT and how they interact to keep you from performing the normal business functions that you're already performing, and then also from implementing strategies for future development.
Absolutely.
Well, let me sort of wind up with giving you a chance to answer one final question. And you mentioned, or I mentioned, that you worked with AIG. And I just want to know, did you and the beta group design their derivative systems from top to finish?
The middle part is what we designed, yeah.
Okay, so for our audience, if you're concerned about AIG, I'll provide Mr. Bugnitz's address later on. Of course, we're merely joking, and he had nothing to do with that part. He only worked with the AIG during their good years when they were doing something useful. So, Tom, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope our audience finds this as enlightening and interesting as I have.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Thank you.